For most of the post-war era, Europe got used to a comfortable financial reality. The United States ran the global financial system, and Europe, more or less, benefited from it. But that system came with strings attached, and today, those strings are starting to look a lot more like chains. First, a basic question. What does it mean for the dollar to be the world's reserve currency? A reserve currency is the money that governments, banks and businesses around the world trust the most. It's the currency used for trade, for savings, for international contracts. When countries hold their foreign exchange reserves, when companies make deals across borders, or when banks settle debts, the US dollar is overwhelmingly the unit of choice. As of 2024, roughly 58% of global foreign currency reserves are still held in dollars, far ahead of the euro, yen, or yuan. But this didn't happen by magic. The dollar's dominance is a product of history and power. After World War II, the US was the only major economy left standing. It had the gold, the factories, the global navy. Under the Bretton Woods system, the dollar was pegged to gold, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. Even after Bretton Woods collapsed in the 1970s, the dollar remained supreme, bolstered by the size of the US economy, the depth of its financial markets, and, critically, the political stability of the American system. Crucially, the US was willing to run large trade deficits, flooding the world with dollars and financing them with treasury bonds that foreign investors eagerly acquired. If you needed a place to park your wealth, you trusted the dollar. This is a long and complicated story. If there is enough demand, we can do a series on it. Europe fit into this system comfortably. It built prosperity while depending on the dollar for stability. And when the euro was launched in 1999, there were grand hopes that it would eventually rival or replace the dollar. But 2 decades later, the euro still accounts for just about 20% of global reserves, a respectable second place, but far from dethroning the king. One of the key mechanisms reinforcing this dependence is the relationship between the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. In times of crisis, like the 2008 global financial crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic, the Fed extends swap lines to major central banks, including the ECB. This means that European banks can access dollar liquidity directly from Frankfurt, backed by Washington. It's a lifeline, and a clear reminder that when the pressure's on, Europe still needs American money to keep its financial system afloat. But these financial ties aren't just about stability, they're also about leverage. Control over the dollar system gives Washington an enormous foreign policy weapon. It can sanction banks, cut off countries from global finance, and pressure companies to obey US laws, even when those companies have no real connection to American soil. One vivid example came after the Trump administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. European leaders, Germany, France, the UK, all opposed the move. They wanted to keep the deal alive, but when push came to shove, they couldn't. American sanctions threatened to block any company doing business with Iran from accessing the US financial system. Major firms, like the French car manufacturer Peugeot, had little choice. Even though France wanted to keep working with Iran, Peugeot had to pull out, losing millions of euros, simply because Washington said so. This was a wake-up call, a brutal reminder that Europe's strategic autonomy didn't extend to its banks or corporations. The Americans didn't have to invade anyone. They just had to threaten to cut off access to dollars. And Europe folded. In theory, that should have been the moment when European leaders realized they needed a plan. Some did talk about creating independent payment systems, like INSTEX, a proposed workaround for Iran trade, but these efforts fizzled out. Too complicated, too risky, too little political will. Part of the problem is that Europe has long overestimated the strength of the euro. When the single currency was introduced, many believed it would quickly challenge the dollar's supremacy. And indeed, the euro brought real benefits: easier trade, more price stability, a unified European market. But replacing the dollar requires more than just issuing a common currency. It requires what the US has: a massive, deep, flexible financial market backed by a sovereign government willing to issue vast amounts of safe debt. The United States can run trillion-dollar deficits, flood the world with treasury bonds, and still have investors begging for more. But now a new twist. The Trump administration no longer sees the dollar's reserve status as a strength, but as a burden. Some officials argue that too much global demand for dollars props up the US currency, hurting American exports and jobs. They openly talk about reducing the world's reliance on the dollar. For Europe, this could be an opportunity, if it's willing to build real financial independence. But seizing that chance would mean doing what it has avoided for decades, thinking and spending like a superpower. Europe, fragmented, cautious, divided, simply can't replicate that. The European Central Bank can backstop markets, but it doesn't have a centralized fiscal authority like the US Treasury. National governments are still in charge of spending and debt, and political resistance to large-scale unified borrowing remains strong, especially in countries like Germany and the Netherlands. So when European leaders occasionally talk about the euro challenging the dollar, it often sounds more like aspiration than strategy. Without a real fiscal union and a willingness to bear the costs of global leadership, the euro will remain a secondary player. And this is where the broader story comes together. Europe's decline isn't just military, it's economic. In 2007, before the financial crisis, the EU and the US had almost identical GDP per capita levels. But today the gap has widened dramatically. As of 2024, US GDP per capita stands at around $89,000, while the EU average hovers closer to $44,000. Even wealthier European countries like Germany and France lag significantly behind the US. And the gap isn't just about income. It's about dynamism, innovation, capital markets, and strategic ambition. Europe still has enormous strengths: human capital, infrastructure, social cohesion. But in both hard power and financial power, it's been operating in an American-made system. And as that system becomes less reliable, Europe faces a hard choice: adapt or become increasingly irrelevant. The age of easy assumptions is over. In money, as in military matters, Europe can no longer afford to be a follower. The question is, does it have the muscle and the will to lead?